this video, I'm going to look at the macro OCR AS paper from 2017. I'm going to look at the short answer questions. So there's a separate video on the multiple choice. This is just going to be the short answer questions. So we have a passage to read, not too long, fortunately, and then there's a few graphs, and you will need to use all of those in your answers. So I've got the mark scheme on the right hand side, which we'll refer to from time to time so that you can see where the marks come from. Now the first question has a very important word in it, the word compare. Now whenever a question has the word compare in it, you're looking at a few key words that you might want to use, like higher or lower, faster or slower. Those are the kind of comparative words. So you don't want to say this is what one country does and this is what another country does. You need to think about using those sorts of comparative terms. So we're looking at the average economic growth rate of the 5 countries with the average global economic growth rate. That's figure 1. So these are the 5 countries. And then it says the solid line represents the annual average GDP growth rate for the global economy. So what we can see is each of these 5 countries has a higher economic growth rate than the global economy. And that's it. There's nothing more to it than that. So it's quite a straightforward question. So don't sort of overthink things. Don't think, oh, well, that seems a bit too easy, because some of these are a bit too easy. Part B, using information from the case study, explain 1. So the key word to look for there is explain and 1. If you state 2, it's not going to give you the marks. You need 1 and you need to explain it. So we've got to look at 1 benefit of lower oil prices in India. So if we go to the passage, just so that we can work through this more quickly, I've highlighted the bit that's relevant. It says lower oil import prices were expected to help increase household real disposable income and help drive down the rate of inflation. So we've got lower oil import prices, and it's key that these are import prices. So when it comes to explaining, lower oil prices in India means that if they're imported, then that's going to be a lower cost of production, and lower cost of production is going to mean prices are likely to fall because the cost of production have fallen. So lower oil prices, lower cost of production, which leads to lower inflation. Then we've got to look at figure 2. What happened to the value of the Indian rupee between 2011 and 2015? And it says explain what happened. So we don't state what happened, we explain. So we need to have a bit more than just looking at the graph. So 2011 to 2015, let's just check that. Yeah, 2011 to 2015, what's happened to the value of the Indian rupee? So 2011 to 2015, what we can see is the value has increased against the dollar. So what does that mean? Well, if the value of the rupee has increased against the dollar, that means that the rupee is now worth more. So you're going to get more dollars for every rupee. So that's what the increase in the value means. And then it says explain, using figure 3, describe the relationship between India's current account balance and its unemployment rate. Now, when you're asked about a relationship, you'd usually be talking about a positive or an inverse, or maybe there's no relationship. Now, this one's a little bit confusing. So we've got India's current account balance. So that's looking at the difference between your exports and your imports, and the relationship between that and the unemployment. So if we just go up to the graph, here we go. So the current account balance as a percentage of GDP is negative. That means there is a deficit. Now, a key thing to take note of is this is where we've got a big deficit. Here, the deficit is smaller. So the deficit is improving. So this going up here is improving deficit. So if we look at the graph, what's going on is it's almost like the opposites, isn't it? So as unemployment is falling, the current account balance is improving. And then we've got unemployment is rising, the current account balance is worsening. And then here, the current account is worsening as unemployment is falling. So you've got different ways that you can word this. So if we just go over to the mark scheme, and we can see the different options that they give you, because it's quite a few. So it says over here, while the current account deficit fell from 3% of GDP to 1%, so it improved by 2%, unemployment fell. So when it improved, when it improved, then the unemployment fell. Then you say there's a direct positive relationship between the falling current account deficit / falling imports and falling unemployment. Or you could say there's an inverse relationship between rising exports and falling unemployment. So what they've done here is they've said, well, if the deficit is improving, that is suggesting that you've got rising exports. If the deficit is worsening, it's suggesting that your imports are rising, or if it's improving, your imports are falling. So they've done these two are sort of specifically picking up on just either exports or imports. Here it says both unemployment and the deficit fell, but if you don't give any figures, then you'd only get 1 mark. So put in some figures like they have here. They've said what it's changed from and to. And if we go to the next question, explain how the change in India's current account balance between 2013 and 15 may have influenced the country's unemployment rate. So 2013 to 2015, how will it have influenced the unemployment rate? So now we're looking at this period here. So we've got to specifically be talking about how does the improving deficit influence the unemployment rate. So the unemployment is falling and the deficit is improving. So we need to think about what is happening here. So unemployment falling, and the deficit is improving. If the deficit is improving, what that means is that exports might be increasing, imports might be decreasing. So why would that influence the unemployment rate? Well, what we've got going on here is if exports are increasing, then you've got more demand for UK goods, and therefore you might need more workers to produce those goods, and more workers to produce those goods means that you're going to have a reduction in unemployment. So if we go over to the mark scheme, check out how they're doing that. So a decline in the deficit could be caused by a fall in imports, which we've got here. Let's just go over here. Rise in net exports would result in higher aggregate demand. That's another way of approaching it. A rise in aggregate demand is likely to produce a high level of employment. So if we've got more exports, that's going to lead to a higher level of employment to produce more goods to export. More workers are needed to produce those goods. And then here we've got the depreciating rupee could have made exports more competitive. So exports are going to be more appealing because they're more competitive. So what you can see from this mark scheme is I've jotted down a few points there, and they've done things in a slightly different order. It doesn't really matter. I was just writing them down in the way that I thought about them. As long as you've got those points, then that's fine. And then E is using a diagram, explain how an increase in spending on infrastructure in India could lead to economic growth. So the first thing to say is that infrastructure would be perhaps spending on better roads or better transport systems. So once you've identified that, then it makes it a little bit easier to know how to answer the question. So there's different diagrams that you could draw for this. It doesn't really matter which one you do. They're allowing 3 different diagrams. So we'll go straight over to the mark scheme to see the diagrams. So the first one is they're accepting a shift to the right of the production possibility curve. And that is because if you've got better infrastructure, transport's going to be better and you're going to be able to produce more of each type of good, consume more capital. So a shift outwards from X to Y. Alternatively, you might want to shift the long run aggregate supply curve to the right, because that is showing that you've got, I suppose in some ways you've got lower cost of production, but you're increasing your maximum potential output because you've got better factors of production. Or you might increase aggregate demand, because if you increase aggregate demand, that is because of the infrastructure being investment, a component of aggregate demand, or maybe the infrastructure could be classed as being government spending. So if we look at the words here, you've got 2 marks for a diagram. Over here, 2 marks for a diagram, and you've got a mark for knowledge of infrastructure. So for your diagram, you need to label your axes correctly for the first mark, and then you need to shift one of your curves for the second mark. And then you need to do some explanation. So increased government spending or investment on infrastructure is the reason why the curve shifts. And then if you've got an increase in your output, so Y1 to Y2 in both these cases, an increase in output is economic growth. So output increases, that means you've got economic growth, because economic growth is your percentage change in GDP. So that would be a good explanation. You could say lower transport costs, or faster internet or more roads is going to increase long run growth. So that's going to be the reason why you would shift your aggregate supply curve to the right. So that's the short answer questions. In addition to the multiple choice short answer questions, you've then got a 10-mark question, and then you have an essay to do as well.